Have you ever been stopped right at the doorway to your own place? Not because you did anything wrong, not because you lacked the right to be there, but simply because, in the eyes of the person in front of you, you didn't look like someone who belonged. Aisha Morgan knew that feeling better than anyone. That morning, the summer sun spilled gold across the upscale marina. The salt in the air, the sound of waves, and the gleam off the hull of the Azure Queen, the yacht she'd paid tens of millions to own. But when she stepped onto the pier, there was no welcoming smile, only an assessing glance from head to toe. A remark light as air, but yet heavy enough to slice deep. This dock doesn't take walk-ins, especially a dress like that. It wasn't just a refusal, it was a verdict on her worth delivered by a stranger in public. Because sometimes injustice doesn't shout. It whispers, just loud enough for the world to hear. But Aisha hadn't come here to argue. She had come to prove something, that real power never needs to yell, and that a person's pride can never be priced by someone else's gaze. They laughed when she called for the marina manager. They mocked when someone she'd once helped turned their back. They live-streamed every second, waiting to see how that woman would be escorted away. But what they didn't know was that the game had been set long before their whispers began. And in just a few minutes, not just the yacht, but the entire marina would belong to Aisha Morgan. If you've ever witnessed or lived through moments of injustice like this, hit like, share this story, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications because tomorrow's story that you don't want to miss. And now, let's go back to that morning, to the very first step Aisha took onto the pier, opening a day that no one here would ever forget. The morning at that marina carried a kind of light other cities could only dream of. Summer sun gilded the water's surface, stretching shimmering trails across each cresting wave. The air carried a faint mix of sea salt and the damp wood scent of the old pier. Waves lapped in a steady rhythm, punctuated by the soft metallic chime of masts brushing against each other, composing a kind of classical soundtrack for the world of the wealthy. The boats were docked in neat rows, their hulls gleaming as if polished with a private kind of sunlight. Each bore a name that rang like the pour of fine crystal. Among them, the Azure Queen stood out, its immaculate white curves and prow aimed seaward, as though it had grown weary of the marina's mediocrity. Aisha Morgan appeared at the far end of the pier, her low heels clicking softly against the wood, each measured step moving at a pace that seemed to make time wait for her. She wore an ivory linen dress, simple but perfectly tailored, as if cut for this very morning. On her wrist, a vintage gold watch, unassuming to most but to the discerning eye, the one possession she had kept from her early difficult years in business. She hadn't come to flaunt wealth or invite admiration. Today, the Azure Queen would take her offshore for an important meeting. One of those deals where the setting was just as crucial as the conversation. Out at sea, wealth wasn't measured in floors of glass towers, but in the brightness of the horizon you were headed toward. People at the marina rarely paid attention to anyone unless given a reason to judge them. Somehow, Aisha became that reason the moment she arrived. Eyes flicked toward her, not to greet, but to weigh. Mid-sentences in nearby conversations were dropped, replaced with quick, sidelong glances before turning away, as though her presence required some unspoken explanation. A man in a white blazer lowered his sunglasses to get a better look, then leaned toward his companion to whisper. The sound of waves and the clinking of masts persisted, but the air seemed to change tempo, slower, heavier, like it was bracing for something about to happen. Aisha drew closer to the gangway leading to the Azure Queen. She looked at its polished hull, the sight as familiar as meeting an old friend. Her fingers brushed the cool railing of the pier, inhaling the mix of salt and fresh paint, steadying herself for the voyage ahead. But before she could set foot on the gangway, a shadow stepped into her path. Tall, broad-shouldered, cutting against the gold of the morning light. His gaze sweeping over her like he was reading a valuation report, the conclusion already unflattering. A story truly begins when someone decides you don't belong where you stand. And that morning, on that pier, it was about to happen to Aisha Morgan. No one here could guess what the end of this morning would look like. The man blocking the Azure Queen was nearly a head taller than Aisha, built solid like a door meant to stay closed. The sunlight washed his shoulders in pale gold, but his eyes were cold enough to dim it. Captain Roderick Vale, the one who held the keys to the ship, stood there as though the entire marina was his personal domain. He didn't speak at first. His gaze started at Aisha's neatly tied hair, slid over her shoulders, paused on the drape of her linen dress, then continued to her low-heeled shoes. This wasn't curiosity. It was the practiced eye of someone appraising a piece of merchandise before deciding whether it was worth their trouble. Vela let the silence stretch a few beats before speaking, his voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. This dock doesn't take walk-ins, especially dressed like that. The words "like that" dropped slow like a pebble into still water. The sound wasn't loud, but the ripples spread instantly. A woman adjusting her wide-brimmed hat turned to look. A young man stopped mid-sip of coffee, lowering his phone to film. Even the mass chime seemed to fade, making room for the quiet tension of expectation. Aisha didn't fire back immediately. She tilted her head slightly as if deciding whether that remark had been careless or deliberate. The salt air lingered, but at this range she could detect the faint scent of cigar smoke clinging to the captain's collar, a smell often carried by men who thought power was a birthright. She didn't ask what made him think he could say that. Instead, she slipped her hand into her dress pocket, pulled out a small peppermint, unwrapped it slowly, and placed it on her tongue. The crinkle of the wrapper was sharp in the space between them, a reply without words. Vale narrowed his eyes, perhaps unused to a reaction that didn't follow the script. Those nearby read a different signal. This was worth staying to watch, because it promised something out of the ordinary. An older woman behind whispered to her friend, "She doesn't look like a yacht guest, probably just here for photos." Even spoken softly, it drew a few more speculative glances, eyes scanning for weakness. Captain Vale kept his position, one hand resting on the gangway railing, a visible line he dared her to cross. He waited for her to either turn back or defend herself. But Aisha did neither. She stood there, the peppermint cooling on her tongue, letting Vale and the entire pier wonder. In a few minutes, that silence would become the sharpest weapon they had ever seen. The marina's air was like the sea before a storm, still but heavy with unease. Vale remained planted, used to two kinds of responses: outrage or retreat. What he got was a third option, one not covered in any of his rulebooks. Aisha smiled. It wasn't wide, it didn't bare teeth. It passed over her face like a cloud's shadow on water. From her pocket, she pulled out another white-wrapped peppermint, so light the breeze could have taken it. She unwrapped it with both hands, slowly, as if each motion were timed to the ticking of the vintage watch on her wrist. The soft crackle of paper filled the space, louder than the murmurs of those nearby. Some eyebrows lifted. They had never seen anyone answer an insult with candy. She slipped it past her lips, biting down just enough to let a crisp snap ring out, like the sound of a secret breaking. As the cool mint spread, her smile returned, slightly sharper this time, enough for him to feel her gaze on him. Vale tilted his head, unsure what he'd missed. This silence wasn't surrender. It was the kind that made onlookers feel they'd stepped into a game without yet seeing the board. Behind him, phones kept recording, comments scrolling in the real time. She's faking calm. Bet she won't do anything. Captain's gonna kick her out. To most, it was idle chatter. To the experienced, it was proof the crowd had no idea who they were watching. Aisha's eyes flicked past Vale toward the Azure Queen. Just for a moment, but in that glance there was the air of someone checking whether the stage was ready for a performance no one expected. She said nothing, took no step forward. Let the space between them stretch taut, each wave against the pier tightening the line like a stringed instrument. And anyone who'd ever played knew, when a string was wound this tight, the smallest touch could make it sing the loudest note. They say great storms start with a breeze. But at the marina that morning, it began with a peppermint. And before the day was over, that peppermint would be the story the entire Marina would tell. Aisha remained exactly where she was, the peppermint melting slow on her tongue, her eyes locked on Captain Vale. She didn't argue. Instead, she slid a hand into the pocket of her light jacket and drew out her phone. Her fingers moved with unhurried precision, scrolling through her contacts until they stopped on a name she knew far too well, Mason Kerr. Mason wasn't just the Marina's manager. Years ago, he had been a struggling businessman, his shipping company teetering on the brink of collapse. When no bank would lend him a dime, Aisha had written the check that saved him, asking only for a modest partnership agreement and the kind of respect that should have lasted a lifetime. The phone rang. Aisha's gaze shifted toward the glass-fronted office near the end of the dock, where Mason usually buried himself in paperwork. Inside, a figure stood, then stepped into the sunlight. The door swung open and light spilled across silver-streaked hair and a face shaped by years of weather and hard decisions. For a moment, Aisha felt something ease in her chest. The corner of her mouth curved into a small, private smile, not to reassure the crowd, but for an old ally she believed would stand beside her. Her eyes held the kind of hope you reserve for someone who owes you more than they could ever repay. Mason's pace was deliberate, his leather shoes tapping out a slow rhythm across the planks. He gave Vale a casual wave before glancing at Aisha. For a heartbeat, she thought the farce was over, that Mason would shut this nonsense down, walk her aboard, and end the gawking. But the nod he gave wasn't for her. Standing beside Vale, his hand resting lightly on the railing, Mason's voice carried across the dock, clear enough for every camera to capture. "The yacht's owner will be here shortly. Please step away from the gangway." Her smile faltered, clipped mid-breath, like a wave caught and cut by an unexpected wind. His words weren't just a refusal. They were a public declaration that she didn't belong here. And he delivered them with the detached tone reserved for lost tourists who needed to be shown the way out. Aisha said nothing, but her gaze lingered on Mason long enough for him to feel the weight of it. It wasn't loud. It didn't accuse. It simply carried the memory of the days when he'd called her my benefactor. Behind her, the crowd murmured. A few short laughs escaped, quickly smothered by hands over mouths or sips of coffee. Phones were raised higher now, the lens tightening on Aisha's face as though waiting for the moment she'd crack. She drew in a slow breath, her shoulders easing. When she spoke, her words were steady, pitched just for Mason, but aimed at no one in particular. Some debts are easier to pay off early. The sentence drifted into the air, its meaning half-veiled but undeniably deliberate. Those with sharper instincts felt the prickle of its edge. Because some debts, when left unpaid, have a way of coming due when you least expect them. Mason's statement had landed like a cold official order, slicing through the air. "The yacht's owner will be here shortly. Please step away from the gangway." No hesitation, no flicker of doubt, as though every handshake, every thank you he'd once given her, had been erased. The wind didn't carry his words away. They sat heavy in the open, inviting the onlookers to join in. A younger man adjusted his camera lens and whispered to his friend, "Get this on video. It's gonna be good." Aisha didn't flinch. But those who knew what to look for saw her spine straighten, her chin lift. Small defenses against an invisible blade. Sunlight bounced off the water, laying a thin film of brightness across her face, masking the thoughts moving behind her eyes. Mason closed the gap to Vale, standing like a long-time comrade. He didn't bother meeting Aisha's gaze anymore. Instead, his eyes slid past her as if she were nothing more than an obstacle to clear away. The indifference in that glance carried more sting than his words. The murmur of the crowd mingled with the wash of the tide into something restless, needling. Someone laughed, a short, sharp pop of sound that triggered a few others, the contagion of ridicule spreading. The marina began to feel less like a dock and more like an arena where judgment was entertainment. A woman in a floral dress, glass of white wine in hand, leaned toward her friend. You can tell she's not a yacht guest, probably just here for pictures pretending it's hers. She didn't aim it directly at Aisha, but she didn't need to. Aisha could have walked away. With one turn, she could have let their stares latch onto someone else. But instead, she stayed. The peppermint on her tongue was nearly gone, leaving only a lingering chill that reached the bridge of her nose. She looked at Vale, then at Mason, holding each gaze longer than comfort allowed, like she was etching them into memory. The sun was brighter now, scattering dancing shards of light over the rippling water. The air around them shifted from curiosity to something hungrier, anticipation for a misstep. Mason, perhaps thinking he'd snuffed out the scene, bent his head toward Vale, muttering something too low for the crowd to catch. But whatever he said, he'd already given them the clip they wanted. What he hadn't given them was the ending. Because every photo, every snippet of video wasn't just capturing a woman denied entry. They were capturing the stillness before a tide turned. And when that tide rose, those who thought themselves safe on higher ground would be the first to get wet. Aisha straightened fully now, her eyes fixed on Mason. This wasn't the look of someone wounded. It was the gaze of someone replaying an old scene, one where he had starred as the man clutching a lifeline she'd thrown him. In a blink, the memory was catalogued, placed neatly in the past. Her voice carried over the waves, calm but cutting. Some debts are easier to pay off early. A few brows furrowed in the crowd. Maybe they didn't understand. Or maybe they felt the quiet threat folded inside the words. Mason twitched, small, almost hidden, before masking it with a frown of feigned confusion. Vale narrowed his eyes as though trying to decipher a code. Aisha offered no explanation. She let the sentence hang, untethered, for anyone brave enough to reach for. The silence that followed felt heavier than her words. A woman in the floral dress stopped smiling, lowering her glass, her focus tightening on Aisha. Those who had ever owed her money, opportunity, reputation would recognize that tone. It was the sound of a bill laid on the table without a due date, because the due date was now. She turned her gaze to the sea where the Azure Queen sat waiting, its white hull gleaming like it already knew who commanded it. In her eyes, the reflection of the water carried a light that wasn't from the sun. It was the light of someone holding the final move in her hand. The crowd didn't know how long they'd been quiet, only that they couldn't look away. And in the minds of those still filming came a thought they couldn't quite shake. If this was just the beginning, what would the ending look like? The answer would come sooner than they thought. And when it did, it wouldn't just be a debt settled. The familiar background rhythm of waves slapping against the dock had always been part of the Marina's morning soundtrack. But now, threaded through that steady pulse, came a voice, soft enough not to be called rude, yet aimed perfectly to pierce Aisha's ear. Probably a gold digger. The words dropped like a small pebble, but their echo traveled far beyond their weight. Aisha didn't have to turn her head to know who had spoken. The deliberate, accidental projection was all she needed to picture the woman. Expensive dress, fingers pinched around a glass of white wine, eyes sweeping over her like she was an out-of-place display item. Beside that woman, a few men in light blazers leaned in together, pretending to discuss the weather. Each phrase carried a smirk tucked inside it. One of them lifted his phone, the lens tilting toward Aisha. That quiet tap of the screen turned the moment into a recording, no longer just an interaction, but a scene. The Marina's mood shifted. This was no longer a place for docking yachts. It had become an impromptu stage with Aisha as the unwilling lead. The audience, well-dressed, phone-wielding spectators, their eyes bright with the thrill of witnessing and sharing. Aisha stood in the center, not stepping back, not stepping forward. She felt every gaze fastening into place around her, every whispered barb like a pin testing her composure. She didn't need social media to understand she was on trial. Here, no judge was needed, only enough cameras and people eager to comment. From a distance, a young man tilted his phone to capture both her and the Azure Queen behind her. The caption she knew would never read, "Woman boarding her own yacht." No, it would be written to bait clicks, to ignite comment wars, to turn her into a public property of ridicule. She scanned the crowd not to memorize faces, but to measure the air around her. There was something about these groups. They were like waves, restless but shallow, forceful but fragile when they finally hit real shore. The irony flickered in her mind. If they knew the truth about the yacht, about her unquestionable ownership, would they delete their videos in shame? Or would they just change their tone and say, "We didn't know"? But she wasn't here to explain, not yet. Because what they didn't realize was that this trial wasn't the only one taking place. And in the next round, these so-called witnesses would become the living proof in a story they'd never want to tell. This trial was only beginning, and they didn't yet know who held the gavel. It took less than a minute for the scene to spill beyond the marina. On the phone screen of a nearby teenager, a live stream interface glowed. The camera wobbled slightly, but still caught Aisha in full, framed by the Azure Queen. The red Live badge in the corner was like a signal flare for others to follow. Within moments, 3, 4, 5 more streams lit up, each from a different angle. Some shot from the side, others from above, all capturing Aisha in the center of a public trial. Comments rained down. Another wannabe rich girl. No way she owns that yacht. Can't wait to see her get kicked out. Some posts dug deeper, feeding off old prejudices. The people typing them didn't care, or didn't know, that they were playing judge, jury, and executioner without a shred of evidence. Aisha could feel the stares of hundreds, then thousands of unseen eyes. This courtroom was larger than any with walls, and every seat was taken. Across the open space, Captain Vale glanced at Mason. They shared the look of men convinced the morning was already theirs. Vale's smugness was the kind only gatekeepers wore. Mason didn't speak, but his small, knowing smirk said enough. He didn't even need to see the ending to believe it was decided. And still, Aisha didn't move. If anything had changed, it was her breathing. Slower, deeper, as though she were filling her lungs with something she planned to place, fully intact on the table later. On one screen, the viewer count ticked upward. Someone typed, "Need more drama." Another replied, "Wait until the captain makes his move." Even as jokes, they were fuel for the live crowd. Vale checked his watch as if her standing there was an inconvenience. Mason adjusted his collar, scanning the cameras to make sure the story was being preserved. But as everyone assumed this was just the middle act of a public embarrassment, Aisha was already writing the ending. And unlike the live streams, her version would not be edited to their liking. Because what started live would end in a moment no one would dare replay. The scattered laughs had settled into a steady rhythm, like polite clapping at a bad performance. Here, though, no ticket was required. A middle-aged man adjusted his phone to keep Aisha and the Azure Queen perfectly framed. Next to him, a young woman typed a caption, "When you try to board $1 million yacht without a ticket." She didn't look up, but she felt the approving nods around her. Comments rolled in like an undertow, quiet but strong enough to pull her image under a layer of bias. Some dissected her shoes, others critiqued her dress. No one asked why she was here. No one considered the story might be the exact opposite of what they imagined. Aisha stayed still. The waves and the laughter blended into one score as if they belonged to the same play. If anyone looked closely, they'd see her gaze pass slowly over each face. Not long enough to linger, but enough to make them feel weighed. It wasn't the look of someone seeking sympathy. It was the look of someone recording everything in an invisible ledger. Vale stood nearby, arms crossed, the easy posture of a man certain he'd defused a problem. Mason busied himself with his cufflinks, occasionally checking that she was still where they'd left her, beneath them. In the crowd, no one noticed that each barb, each tap of a record button, was adding another brushstroke to a portrait they'd one day wish they hadn't helped paint. Aisha knew it. She knew they thought they had the plot, but very soon they'd realize they'd gotten it wrong from the very first line. She closed her eyes for a second, breathing in the salt air. When she opened them, a faint smile touched her lips, one meant for a thought she kept to herself. And if anyone paused long enough to think, they might ask, while they were laughing, did they ever stop to wonder who the woman they mocked really was? Aisha had let them speak long enough for Vale to stand with arms crossed in smug satisfaction, for Mason to wear his carefully constructed mask of indifference, and for the crowd to believe they held the entire story in the palm of their hand. But even the gentlest wave has a moment when it turns. She lowered her handbag from her shoulder, setting it into the cradle of her palm as if she were holding something fragile. A hush rippled over the dock, subtle but undeniable, as though the room, or in this case the open air, had just realized the tempo of the scene was changing. Her fingers found the clasp and released it with a quiet click, sharp enough to cut through the steady rhythm of waves beneath the pier. From the bag, Aisha drew out a slim folder. The rustle of legal documents was loud in the stillness, like wind slipping through the frame of an old door. A few in the nearest rows lowered their phones, their lenses now shifting to her hands where the embossed seal of a prominent law firm gleamed faintly under the sun. She opened the folder to the first page, revealing bold, unshakable letters. Certificate of Ownership. Beneath, her name, Aisha Morgan, stood as undeniable fact. In the crowd, a few faces wavered, the recognition dawning that they might have been listening to the wrong melody all along. But Aisha didn't hand the papers over. She lifted her gaze to Vale, lips curling into something between an invitation and a challenge. Neither pleading nor taunting, but a quiet bait for him to step into the trap she'd set. Vale stared at the document like a cat spotting a bird through glass. He didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he placed one hand on the railing, leaning just slightly toward Mason. Mason raised a brow, a flicker so brief most would miss it, before sliding back into his practiced calm. In that instant, Aisha understood. The issue wasn't the validity of her documents, it was that here, on this dock, the law didn't always live on paper. It lived in the hands of the one holding the keys to the gate. She kept the folder steady, letting the paper edges brush softly together, a reminder she hadn't come empty-handed. But the quiet thought crept in. In a place where truth could be twisted into entertainment, would these pages be enough to turn the tide? Vale's lips pressed into a line, his mind turning over something far removed from the content of the file. Around them, the salt air tangled with the scent of white wine swirling in glasses, making the morning feel heavy and sour. And in that moment, Aisha realized she'd placed her piece on the board. Yet no one had agreed to play by her rules. When the rules are in another man's hands, every move you make can be flipped into a blade against you. The folder rested in her grasp, the pages breathing with her. The crowd leaned in, camera lenses edging closer, poised to capture what they thought would be the final act. She'd hand over the documents, the captain would let her board, and the whole thing would end blandly. But Vale wasn't the type to let a scene close before he delivered the last line. With a single long step, he closed the gap, his calloused hand snapping out like a mooring rope. Aisha felt the whisper of air as he wrenched the folder from her grip. No request, no preamble. The sound of the cover tearing free from her hand was sharp, but sharper still was the reap as he took the first page, her name in bold, and split it clean down the middle. The rip echoed louder than any shout. The scraps fluttered down like broken-winged birds, turning in the breeze before landing on the wooden planks. Aisha's eyes followed them, unblinking, while even the ocean seemed to pause in its rhythm. Vale wasn't finished. One by one, he shredded the remaining pages with deliberate precision, making it a performance. Proof that his power wasn't just in the keys to the yacht, but in his ability to erase anything that didn't fit his law. The tearing merged with laughter, first in low bursts, then swelling. Someone clapped. A cameraman dropped his rig to laugh before hoisting it again, eager for the defeat shot. The air now carried a sting, salt from the sea mingling with the acrid scent of freshly torn paper. The smell of a name scrubbed away in public. Aisha's hand hung loosely at her side, her fingers still faintly tingling from the sudden emptiness. In the eyes of the crowd, this was the climax. A woman stripped of her claim, her ownership ripped apart in front of dozens in person and hundreds more on screens. They didn't know or care that only the paper was gone, not the truth. Vale dropped the last fragments to the ground, pressing a boot over them before stepping back with a satisfied tilt of his head. He turned to Mason, sharing a glance like two men who had just completed a clean job. Aisha glanced at the paper littering the dock. One tiny scrap still bore a curve of a letter from her name before the wind carried it away. She knew what had really been torn here, and it wasn't the contract. The breeze swirled the remnants at her feet, a small cyclone under the steady sky. The sound of the waves faded behind another kind of stillness, the taut quiet before a storm. Aisha didn't bend to retrieve the shreds. She didn't speak to protest or explain. Her gaze lifted slowly to meet Vale's. It wasn't anger burning there, but a cold, honed edge. The look of a blade unsheathed and laid on the table, sharp enough to chill without a single cut. Vale's smirk twitched, his confidence holding for only a few heartbeats before something quick, invisible, passed through his eyes. A half-step retreated, though only in his mind. Mason watched her, then looked to Vale. His hand gripped the railing harder, the question slipping into his thoughts. Why wasn't she reacting as expected? He'd seen anger before, but never this. Stillness so weighted it tilted the entire dock in her direction. The crowd shifted. Laughter thinned, replaced by patches of quiet, as if they too were waiting for her move. But no move came. Only that same stance, her lips pressed into the faint suggestion of a secret only she knew. "Is she going to do something?" someone whispered. The question found no answer, only spread, threading through the onlookers until some of their eyes turned uncertain. The phones kept recording, but their owners felt the strange sensation of losing control of the narrative. Each passing second made her silence less a gap to be filled and more a mirror, one that forced them to see themselves. They expected an outburst, a defense, a crack in her composure. Aisha gave them none, because she knew sometimes silence is the loudest declaration. And in that silence, one truth stood sharper than any rebuttal. Not one person here truly understood the woman they were trying to break. The most dangerous thing isn't your opponent's voice. It's when they go silent, and you have no idea what comes next. The click of high heels on wood came in measured, deliberate beats, cutting clean through the harbor's chatter. The crowd instinctively shifted, parting just enough to make way, as though a figure of consequence had stepped onto the stage. Clarisse Devereaux, president of the Yacht Association, emerged, white gloves fitted perfectly over her hands, a wide-brimmed hat dipping low to shadow part of her face, as if she'd strolled straight out of an aristocrat's afternoon tea. Her voice was light as silk, so soft one could almost believe it, incapable of leaving a mark. "What's going on here?" She hadn't aimed the question at anyone in particular, yet both Vale and Mason subtly adjusted their stance, making room for her to stand at the center. Her gaze swept over Aisha, then across the crowd, a measuring look as though she were plotting the exact position of every piece on a chessboard. "I believe everything can be resolved peacefully," Clarisse went on, her tone smooth and even. "We are people who love the sea, who value elegance. It would be a shame for this harbor to become a place of noisy disputes." The words sounded like an invitation to sit at a negotiation table, but to Aisha, each syllable felt like a silk thread being wound tighter, pulling her into an invisible net. Clarisse radiated fairness, but somewhere deep in her eyes lingered something that didn't belong to reconciliation. It felt more like a test, one designed to see who would play by the rules and who would be quietly cut from the game. The crowd murmured. A few nodded, reassured that the adult had arrived to take control. A woman whispered to her friend, "Clarisse always keeps this harbor free of trouble. Lucky she's here." The words brushed Aisha's ear, mixing with the tang of salt air and the gentle rhythm of the waves. Sweet on the surface, but bitter underneath. Clarisse stepped closer, now only an arm's length away. She tilted her head slightly, a light smile playing on her lips, though it never reached her eyes. "I think we can find a reasonable solution." Aisha didn't answer right away. She studied the woman in front of her, weighing whether that voice was offering a genuine invitation, or whether it was velvet wrapped tightly around a sharpened blade. Vale and Mason stepped back, assuming the stance of objective observers, at least in appearance. In reality, their eyes gleamed with the quiet certainty that Clarisse would say exactly what they wanted, without them ever having to speak. The crowd leaned in, a few phones rising again. No one wanted to miss the resolution, certain it would be the neat ending to a noisy morning. But some conversations start soft, only to end with a cut so deep no one saw it coming. Aisha knew Clarisse wasn't here to calm the waves. She was here to steer the wind. Clarisse kept her smile, but when she spoke again, there was a thin wire of steel running through the silk, just enough for the sharpest ears to hear. "If you are truly the owner of the Azure Queen," she said, adjusting the edge of her tailored coat with gloved fingers, "then it shouldn't be difficult to prove it. Right now." Aisha didn't move. Clarisse tilted her head again, as though stating something simple and obvious. But the next words came slow, each polished with her innate air of aristocratic authority. "Pay the docking fee of $3 million, marked on the spot." The words landed like metal on wood. Cold, heavy, final. For a heartbeat, silence swept through the crowd before it was swallowed by whistles, chuckles, and little gasps of delight. A man behind them laughed. "Oh, now this is entertainment." A young woman raised her phone higher and murmured to her companion, "$3 million on the spot. You have to record this moment." Clarisse didn't flinch. She stood like the architect of the rules, entirely unbothered by the thought of refusal. She knew the number wasn't just a barrier, it was a stage, a public dare. If Aisha failed to meet it, her story would forever be stamped with a single label: fraud. Vale and Mason exchanged a quick, wordless look. Satisfaction glimmered there. This was the anchor meant to keep Aisha rooted in place, surrounded by a wall of camera lenses. Still, Aisha stayed silent. Her gaze drifted from Clarisse to the crowd, catching the eager grins of those convinced they were moments away from watching a perfect collapse. But she also caught other eyes, fewer but deeper, watching with quiet suspicion, as though wondering whether this was truly the end, or just another layer of the play. $3 million, Clarisse repeated, her voice a velvet-wrapped blade. "And here, and now?" The demand hung in the air, sketching a vivid fantasy in the minds of the onlookers. A suitcase bursting open, stacks of crisp bills inside, and, of course, the unmasking of the woman they were certain was pretending. The waves kept rolling against the dock, but now they sounded less like music and more like a countdown. The crowd leaned forward, drinking in every flicker of Aisha's expression. Clarisse's smile didn't change, but in her eyes was the cold glint of someone who knew she'd just set her most elegant trap. And everyone waited to see whether the prey would struggle or step willingly inside. The phrase $3 million on the spot still hung between them, a fine thread that held every gaze to the same point. Phones rose higher, fingers hovering over record buttons ready to capture what they were sure would be the finishing blow. Aisha didn't move. She didn't protest. She didn't explain. She only tilted her head slightly, a small motion, but enough for all to see that her eyes were locked on Clarisse's. There was no blaze of anger there, no flash of wounded pride. Instead, they were cold, deep, and polished like steel honed to a mirror's edge. In that moment, Clarisse's flawless smile didn't falter, but those who looked closely might have noticed the faintest drop at one corner. Not fear, but the knowledge that the gaze before her had cut straight through the velvet to the blade beneath. Aisha stayed silent. That silence thickened the air, pressing down on every breath. A few in the crowd coughed, a handful whispered. But as they watched, they realized this wasn't the silence of surrender. It was the silence of someone who'd read the entire script ahead of time and was waiting for the perfect moment to turn the last page. Vale glanced from Clarisse to Aisha, searching for reassurance that their plan was still unfolding as intended. Mason's grip on the railing tightened, his eyes scanning Aisha's face for any crack in her composure. She let the seconds stretch, testing the patience of the entire dock. With each beat of stillness, a few faces in the crowd lost their easy smiles. A few laughs grew thinner. The onlookers were beginning to realize they didn't actually know what they were waiting for. A sea breeze lifted the scarf draped across Aisha's shoulders. Salt, sunlight, and the scent of fresh paint from the yachts mingled in the air, but none of it masked the heavier smell of tension. She drew in a slow breath, as if memorizing every detail of this moment. Then, without warning, she tilted her head just a touch more, eyes still fixed on Clarice. It wasn't a challenge, it wasn't a plea. It was a look that made the other person wonder. What does she know that I don't? And once that question takes root, it clings like salt to skin after a long day at sea. Because sometimes the most dangerous blade isn't the one you see raised in front of you, but the one you never notice until it's already in the other person's hand. Aisha turned her face slowly toward the sea. On any other morning, it might have been a simple, even idle gesture. But here in the dense, waiting air of the harbor, it broke the rhythm like a missed beat in a perfectly rehearsed symphony. Every gaze fixed on her seemed to hesitate, unsure why the woman at the center of the circle would choose this moment to look at the water. She drew in a deep breath. Salt, the resin of the pier's wood, and the cool bite of morning wind filled her lungs. The waves tapped against the hulls in steady, repeating strokes, each one counting down toward a moment only she could see. Every crest, every hush of foam was another step closer. Behind her, the murmurs continued. A few soft laughs rose, but without the same sharpness as before. They thought she'd turned away in surrender, seeking escape in a view with no boundaries. But the shrewder eyes in the crowd noticed something else. Aisha wasn't looking at the sea like someone searching for an exit. She was reading it, the way a seasoned sailor reads the wind and the tide before setting sail. Vale, arms still folded, tilted his head slightly as if trying to guess her next move. Mason, despite his composed stance, squinted, aware that something in the story might be slipping from his grasp. Clarice's smile remained, but her gloved hand brushed her opposite wrist, a small, precise motion that betrayed a shift in her own calculations. Aisha let her shoulders loosen, the wind combing through her hair. Without turning, she could picture each of their expressions. Vale's confidence, Mason's tightening focus, Clarice's watchful poise. And somewhere in the crowd, curiosity from some, unease from others. Her father's voice came to her, soft but certain, from years ago on the lake. You can't control the wind, but you can set the sail. Back then, it sounded like advice for a stubborn child. Now, in the middle of a harbor full of spectators, she finally understood. The crowd didn't realize that while they were glued to the scene before them, the real tide was shifting somewhere else. They saw stillness, but they couldn't hear the machinery turning just out of sight. A ship's horn moaned from offshore, low, drawn out, pulling the onlookers out of their scattered thoughts. Someone asked, "What's going on?" No one answered. All eyes drifted back to Aisha, still facing the horizon, as if in quiet conversation with something no one else could hear. Because sometimes, just before the tide turns, the water goes still enough to make you forget the waves were ever there. At the pier's edge, Mason leaned toward Vale, his voice low enough to hide from the crowd, though not so low that Aisha wouldn't hear if she wanted to. "She's done," he said, his lips curling into a closed smile. Vale nodded, his gaze on her back like a fisherman watching a hooked fish, ready to reel in. Their confidence spread to those nearby. Short, knowing chuckles broke out. They were used to clean endings, the weak discarded, the strong unshaken. None of them imagined the story could turn when all the pieces looked set. But Aisha's posture told a different story. To the casual eye, she might have seemed lost in defeat, resigned to the script others had written. To the perceptive few, her slow, measured breathing hinted at something else. Not surrender, at preparation. The tempo of the scene shifted. The waves still broke in rhythm, but deeper now. The crowd's chatter softened, as though they feared disturbing whatever was forming in this moment. And in that quiet, they began to feel it. The sense that something was coming, even if they couldn't name it. Mason checked his watch, the gesture casual but edged with impatience. Vale shifted his weight, ready to end the charade and move on. They thought the stage was theirs. They'd forgotten that sometimes the lead doesn't reclaim the center by stepping forward, only by standing still until the audience turns of its own accord. A sudden gust snapped the harbor's flags into sharp motion. A few people looked up instinctively like they had been shaken from a looping dream. And in that instant, the smug whispers of Mason and Vale seemed louder, the contempt in them bare. Aisha didn't turn. She only inclined her head slightly as if she'd heard every word, then returned her gaze to the sea. It was a small, almost meaningless movement, but it made a few people in the crowd blink, sensing a shift they couldn't define. Because when the supposed victors start to relax, that's often when the tide turns. The harbor sat under a thin, fragile quiet, like early mist over water, delicate but heavy with the weight of what's about to break. People adjusted to the slowness, convinced Aisha had been locked into the role of the loser, waiting for the curtain to fall. Then, from far off, another sound pressed into the moment. Low, steady, pulsing. Not waves, not wind. Engines. The rumble of vehicles on the stone-paved road leading to the pier rolled toward them. Not hurried, but firm, like war drums marking the advance of an army. Each growl of the engines seemed to vibrate through the ground, drawing curious heads toward the source. Aisha still didn't move, but the faint curve at her lips was enough for anyone nearby to see. She had heard them long ago. Perhaps she'd been waiting for them. Vale frowned, catching the missing piece too late. Mason's eyes narrowed toward the harbor gates, his first visible crack all morning. The engines grew louder, not one vehicle, several approaching together. Tires scraped over the dry stone, harmonizing with the deep thrum of power. It was a sound anyone who understood influence would recognize, the sound of arrival. The crowd shifted aside from the center path, curiosity overtaking their fixation on the earlier performance. Someone whispered, "Who is that? What kind of convoy is this?" No one answered, but eyes began to bounce. Aisha, the gate, back to Aisha, as if fitting together pieces of a picture they didn't yet understand. Clarissa's smile stayed, but her gloved hand tightened. She knew such arrivals were never without reason. Vale searched the crowd for reassurance and found none. Even the small, knowing laughs from before had gone quiet. Only then did Aisha turn, slowly, deliberately, no rush in her motion. Her gaze brushed over Vale, Mason, Clarice. She didn't linger on any, yet left each with the distinct sense of being seen through. The wind brought with it the salt of the sea and the exhaust of the approaching engines. The crowd's eyes flicked toward the gate, but in truth the stage had already spun. The person they thought was a spectator had just become the center of a new act. Because sometimes the drumbeat of a coming storm doesn't come from the sky. It comes from the road right behind you. The convoy rolled to a precise halt at the harbor gates, each vehicle aligned so perfectly it might have been measured before the wheels touched the planks. Doors swung open in near unison, quiet enough to seem effortless, but with a weight that cut through the steady hush of waves. Evan Locke emerged first, tall, lean, the charcoal gray suit fitting like it was sewn onto him, polished shoes catching the sunlight in sharp flashes. Beside him, the chairman of the Port Authority stepped forward, silver hair neatly combed, his very posture radiating the sort of authority that makes people unconsciously straighten their backs. No one in the crowd spoke. Even the chatter and sly laughter that had rippled through the morning evaporated, as if someone had silently drawn the oxygen out of the air. What remained was a taut, suspended stillness. Vale's brow ticked upward. Mason swallowed, hard. Clarissa's polite smile remained, but a faint tremor in its edge betrayed the first crack. The live streamers lowered their voices to nothing, lenses swiveling to capture the slow, deliberate advance of the two men. Evan's eyes never wandered to the onlookers. They locked on Aisha from the first step, and that, more than anything, unsettled people. In the narrative they'd written in their minds, Aisha was just a side figure, the incidental target of the morning's scene. But Evan's focus shifted the center of gravity instantly. Aisha didn't move. The sunlight caught her face and hair, ringing her in a halo that seemed too intentional to be chance. Her silence drew the crowd tighter, each person wondering what tether bound her to the men approaching. Salt air and the distant cadence of open water waves wrapped the moment. Evan and the chairman moved down the weathered boardwalk, like each step was the beat of a drum only they could hear. Something intangible but undeniable was drawing closer, a force strong enough to shake the pillars people assumed were immovable. Some in the crowd exchanged quick glances as if to ask, "What's happening?" but no one dared speak. The stillness felt like ice. One loud crack could send it shattering. They stopped only a few paces from Aisha. The chairman's gaze swept over Vale, Mason, Clarice, lingering just long enough on each to register. Then he turned to Aisha, eyes sharp but with a curious, knowing depth. And in that glance it became clear that this morning wasn't going to end the way anyone thought. Because sometimes, when people think the curtain has fallen, it's only the start of the next act. Evan didn't need an introduction. He stood in the open space, letting the tide's hush frame his voice. Deep, unhesitating. "This morning," Evan said, each word falling like stones into still water, "the entire harbor has been officially transferred to a new owner." He paused, scanning the faces before settling on the final blow. That owner is Aisha Morgan. The shock spread like a ripple across oil. Phones buzzed in palms. Live streams shivered with unsteady hands. They thought they'd been filming a stranger denied boarding a yacht, when in fact, they'd been front row for a power transfer no one had invited them to witness. Vale's expression darkened as if a shadow had passed over the sun. His earlier smugness burned off in an instant, leaving only a stiffness he couldn't hide. Mason stood frozen, lips pressed thin. Whether holding back an apology or a curse, no one could tell. Clarice, whose poise was legendary, allowed a faint twitch to break her cool mask. Aisha stayed still, letting the silence stretch until the truth of Evan's words seeped into every bone present. She didn't rush to fill it. She let them feel the shift of power. Evan's voice remained steady, as if reciting terms signed long before. "From today forward, all operations here fall under Miss Morgan's authority. That includes staffing, contracts, and yacht access." The last words landed heavy. Everyone understood. The gate they'd barred her from now belonged to her. Vale cleared his throat, but the sound was closer to a strained gulp. Mason's eyes darted, searching for some conversational foothold, but found only the curious stares of a crowd whose smirks had turned to something else. Anticipation. Clarice said nothing, her grip on her handbag whitening her knuckles. Only then did Aisha speak, voice light, almost conversational. "Seems like a good day to start a new chapter." The laughter that answered wasn't mockery this time. It was the sharp, startled kind that comes when a table is flipped without warning. But what held their gaze wasn't just the reversal, it was the sense this wasn't over. Aisha stepped forward, closing the space between her and Vale to no more than an arm's length. Sunlight slid across her shoulder, catching on a smile small in size but sharp in effect, enough to make Vale draw back half a step. "You know the best thing about ownership, Captain Vale?" Her voice was low, velvet-lined, yet each word edged like grit on glass. Vale said nothing, glancing to Mason, then down to the boards beneath his feet, as if hoping for a way out. Aisha tilted her head, eyes unblinking, and cut the air with a clean, merciless line. "I own this place, and you are fired. Right here, where you stand." The words needed no echo. Fired hung above them like a referee's final whistle, ending any defense before it could start. Vale's flush climbed hot and fast. A chuckle broke loose from somewhere in the crowd, too quick to stifle. The waves seemed louder now, as if the harbor itself was leaning in. Phones tilted high, framing Aisha and Vale together, documenting every flicker of the captain's unraveling composure. Moments ago, they'd been streaming her humiliation. Now they were recording her ascendancy. From her slight remove, Clarice's eyes swept Vale like a chess player, removing a piece from the board. Cold, efficient. Mason didn't meet Aisha's gaze, his shoulders sagging under the realization he'd backed the wrong player. Aisha spared them no more than a glance. She turned to Evan, nodded once, then let her eyes drift toward the open sea. In that instant, it was obvious this wasn't about reclaiming her place on the yacht. The harbor itself had become part of her domain. Vale's mouth opened, but the hum of the Azure Queen's engines cut clean across his voice. A mechanical reminder his time was over. The crowd eased back, one by one, clearing a path to the pier. Aisha's stride was unhurried, her posture unshaken, as though this had been on the day's agenda all along. Online, the captions wrote themselves, from denied boarding to harbor owner in a single morning. The checkmate no one saw coming. But here, on the dock, what lingered was the image of Vale. Rooted in place, a man stripped from the stronghold he thought untouchable. And the crowd knew. This was only the opening move in a much larger game. 2 harbor security officers stepped forward. Not hurried, but firm, flanking Captain Vale like iron doors closing in. He tried to keep his stride even, yet his shoulders trembled ever so slightly. Whether from anger or the sheer weight of public humiliation was impossible to tell. The crowd, which had fallen silent after Aisha's announcement, began to murmur again. A few stifled laughs, scattered whispers, each like a cold pinprick against skin. But what kept every eye locked wasn't Vale's walk. It was his face. Phones lifted in near-perfect unison. Screens flickered as live streams captured the full progression of his expression. Flushed red at the initial challenge, drained white upon hearing the harbor had changed hands, and finally the ashen gray of a man realizing he'd been reduced to a background character on the very stage he thought he owned. Social media commentary ignited almost instantly, the look of a man who lost everything in under 10 minutes. If eyes could write, this face would be a tragedy in 3 acts. Black Queen checkmate. Aisha stood a few meters away, neither approaching nor turning away. She left the space between them like a pane of glass, clear, unavoidable, and impossible to step through without locking eyes. Vale looked at her once, only once, then turned sharply as if afraid to see his own reflection staring back from hers. Mason drifted toward the back, searching for an escape from the cameras. Clarice's polite smile lingered, but her grip on her bag's handle tightened, calculating her next move. No one said it aloud, but the truth was plain. From this moment on, the board had been reset, and Aisha now held the queen. Vale was escorted down the pier, past masts trembling gently in the wind. The waves lapped as they always did, yet each crest now seemed to underline a single fact. He no longer belonged here. Camera lenses followed, magnifying the isolation of a man cast out of the circle of power. His face, wordless, self-explanatory, had become the message. And from Manhattan penthouses to Florida beach cafes, viewers across live streams shared a common understanding. Some defeats need no explanation. They are written in the eyes. But this was not the final scene. Aisha remained silent, witness, and perhaps already calculating the last move. News didn't need a press release to spread. Within 10 minutes of Vale's removal, social media burned like dry brush in a coastal wind. The clip of him stepping off the pier, face shifting from red to white to gray, exploded across hundreds of accounts, from luxury lifestyle bloggers to high society exposé channels. What turned it viral wasn't just the footage. Someone had captioned it mid-frame. "The captain's face says it all." 6 words that distilled the entire arc. Power, prejudice, and a checkmate no one saw coming. Hours later, the hashtag "The Captain's Face Says It All" climbed to the top of trending lists. Each repost brought new variations. Vale's expression spliced into Edvard Munch's "The Scream." A still of his pursed lips captioned, "When you realize you've been fired?" Live on the internet, an anonymous account claiming to be a former harbor employee posted stories of Vale using his authority to humiliate those he deemed out of place. The post was liked, shared, and dissected relentlessly. His image shifted from stern captain to a public emblem of arrogance brought low. Aisha, meanwhile, posted nothing. Her silence was read as the loudest statement. She didn't need to speak. The world was doing it for her. As the memes roared, quieter, sharper debates surfaced. How many Captain Vales are out there unseen? This isn't just about a harbor. It's about the architecture of power itself. Mason vanished from view. Clarice withdrew to the association's office. Their retreat only added tension, prompting speculation. Would they strike back? Or was this the breath before a counterattack? Through the salt air and measured rhythm of the tide, Aisha strolled the pier. Not like someone fresh from a public battle, but as if she'd been the harbor's master all along. She knew hashtags fade in days, but the shifts they spark can last much longer. In the crowd, some eyes began to watch her differently, not just as the victor, but as the one writing the next rules of the game. The question was, how long could new rules stand before someone tried to break them? The wind off the sea carried the timeless scent of salt and the patient beat of waves, older than any human story. The crowd dispersed slowly, each person leaving with a fragment of the morning. A photo, a clip, a sentence to retell in their own voice. Laughter still flickered here and there, but softer now, tempered by the gravity of Aisha's silence. She stood as though the outcome had always been hers. Shoulders straight, hands loose, eyes fixed on where the horizon dissolved into water. Vale was gone, Mason and Clarice too, but their absence left no relief, only the sensation of an aftershock. A young reporter, camera still slung around his neck, hovered a few steps away. He didn't dare ask, but his gaze was clear. Would she offer even one line to close this story now burning across the internet? Aisha turned slightly, letting the wind brush her hair back. Her voice, low but carrying, slid into the grain of the pier and over the water. The tide always returns, when no one's expecting it. No one answered. Some frowned, as if puzzling over a riddle. Others nodded, as though it had struck a private chord. Though she hadn't named Vale or the morning's events, everyone knew exactly who and what the words were meant for. It was no threat, no forgiveness. Just a fact. Cold, slow, inevitable. She walked away, her heels tapping the boards like punctuation marks in the hush. The tide kept its rhythm, counting down to the moment when what's taken will find its way back. Farther down, phone screens still glowed, preserving the scene. Some would overlay her words on images of open water. Others would roll them as text across videos. And there would be those, Vale among them, who'd hear the line replaying in sleepless nights, wondering when the tide would come for them. Because the most unsettling truth isn't that the tide is coming. It's realizing it's been at your feet all along. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.